The wind came first, a low, aching moan that swept across the Carolina coastline like the whisper of something ancient and inevitable. It rattled the rusted street signs on the outskirts of Bluewater Cove and rolled in waves through the dunes before colliding with the ocean, a beast of breath and salt that would not be quieted. Then the sudden and merciless rain struck the windshield of Imelda Ramirez's aging sedan with 1,000 impatient fists. The wipers groaned under its weight, their frantic sweep carving a dim tunnel through a night that had folded in on itself. The two-lane stretch of Highway 17 was a cruel ribbon, even in daylight, bending through marsh and black water with nothing but faded white lines to suggest safety. Tonight it felt like a wager Imelda hadn't agreed to a bet with a sky that had already decided to win. Her knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, tendons straining like ship ropes in a gale. 8 months pregnant and bone-tired from a 14-hour double at the Blue Lantern diner, she was driving on stubbornness alone. The heater coughed, as if resenting its own effort, and the cabin smelled faintly of damp wool. The sweater she had thrown over her uniform still clung to the ghost of rain. She told herself she could make it home before the worst storm hit, but like most things in her life, the storm hadn't cared about her plans. The baby stirred beneath her ribs, a slow, tidal roll that made her press her lips together and breathe deep. Every dollar she'd scraped over the last few months was for this child, for diapers and formula, for the second-hand crib she had assembled in the corner of her narrow bedroom while the walls listened and the wind came through the cracks. She could live with the cottage's leaking roof, with the way the kitchen light flickered like a nervous tick, with the old heater that growled like a dog before giving warmth. But she could not live with the thought of her baby needing something she couldn't provide. That was the vow she'd written across her bones. So she worked. She worked until her feet burned and her shoulders locked. Her reflection in the diner's restroom mirror looked like a woman made of static and grit. She worked and told herself she was strong enough to carry this weight, strong enough to fight off the loneliness that slid through the cracks of an empty house when the night pressed close. She slowed for a curve, headlights bouncing weakly against slick blacktop, and that's when she saw it, a shadow, half-formed in the rain's blur, a figure moving along the narrow shoulder, bent forward as if the wind were trying to shove him off the world's edge. Imelda's heart gave a startled kick. Out here there was nothing, no streetlights, no gas stations humming with fluorescent security, just miles of brine dark ocean to one side and marshland to the other, trembling under the storm's assault. She considered pressing harder on the gas, letting common sense drown out the flicker of something softer. Alone, heavily pregnant, in the middle of a storm that had teeth. Every true crime story she had ever read flashed like lightning in her mind, but the next sweep of the wipers cleared her view and her breath stalled. The figure was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, under a torn suit jacket, his white dress shirt clinging to a frame that spoke of both strength and something broken. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, his face pale under the street glare of her headlights. One hand pressed against his side and the fabric was darker than rainwater. Blood. Her first instinct screamed drive. Don't stop! Protect the baby! Her foot twitched on the pedal, but another voice rose like a hand laid over her thoughts. Her mother's voice was quiet and confident, as if it had been waiting all these years for this exact mile of this same road. We help when we can, Imelda. That's who we are. But we keep our eyes open. It was the creed she had been raised on, as fundamental as any inheritance, though her mother had left little else when she died, just a name of faith and a cornbread recipe that could make hard days easier. Imelda eased off the accelerator, the tyres hissing their protest against waterlogged asphalt. Her pulse hammered hard and hot. One hand slid toward the glove compartment where a can of pepper spray lay tucked like a promise. Don't be reckless, she murmured to herself, though she didn't know if it was a warning or permission. The headlights swept across him again as she slowed. The man lifted his head. For the briefest moment their eyes met through the glass and the blur of rain. Green, startling and sharp like shards of bottle glass polished by time. There was something in them, something that made her breath snag in her throat. Not menace, not the dull vacancy of danger, desperation. And behind it something quieter, something that looked absurdly like a plea. Imelda lowered the passenger side window, just enough for her voice to thread through the rain. You all right? She called, keeping her tone flat the way you do when you're ready to bite if the hand you're reaching for tries to strike. The man's lips moved, and though his voice was raw and threaded with pain, it carried a refinement she hadn't expected. Please, I need a ride into town. I won't hurt you, I swear. Everything in her warned her to keep driving, to roll the window up, press the pedal down and vanish into the wet, black throat of the night. But he was limping badly. Each step is a stagger. The storm clawed at him like it wanted him back, like the road might swallow him if she turned away. Imelda thought of the night her mother had opened their door during a hurricane for a stranded neighbour, belly round with Imelda's older brother, voice steady as candlelight. Kindness is our legacy, her mother had said, stirring soup on a stove that glowed like a star while the wind howled at the shutters. The baby pressed soft feet against her ribs, a small insistent drumbeat. Imelda reached across the seat and popped the locks with a click that sounded louder than thunder. You can get in, she said, her voice iron under velvet, but I've got protection and I know how to use it. A faint smile, something like relief, flickered at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. He pulled the door open and folded himself into the seat with a care that spoke of pain knotted deep. The scent that came with him was rain salt and the copper tang of blood. He moved stiffly, jaw tightening as he slammed the door against the screaming wind. Thank you, he said, breath uneven but still carrying the quiet authority of a man unaccustomed to needing help. I'm Richard. Richard Harris. She didn't offer her name. Not yet. She just shifted the car into drive and let the wheels find the trembling line of the road again. You're hurt, she said, after a moment, her eyes cutting toward the dark stain blooming against his ribs. The hospital's closer to town. No hospitals. The words came fast, not cruel, but final, like a lock snap. Somewhere I can rest. I'll be fine. How he said it like refusing help was the most natural thing in the world sent a shiver down her spine. His suit was ruined, but its bones were expensive, stitched in the language of money, and men who ruled rooms most people never saw. Even scratched the watch on his wrist looked like it cost more than her car. Whatever trouble he'd crawled out of tonight wasn't the kind that happens to ordinary men. You don't look fine, Richard, she said. I've had worse. He let his head fall back against the seat lashes, clumping wet voice thinning at the edges. They drove silently for a mile, the wipers keeping a grim rhythm against the storm. Imelda's cottage wasn't far now, a weather-beaten blue at the edge of the marsh, its porch sagging like an older man's shoulders. She'd never brought a stranger home in her life. She'd never even thought about it. But leaving him on that road felt wrong in a way that clawed at her marrow, maybe because he was bleeding, perhaps because she knew something about being alone in a storm. My place is close, she said finally, eyes fixed on the blur of white lines. I've got a first aid kit. After that you're on your own. Richard's gaze slid open just enough to find her face in the dim light, and something passed between them, a flicker, like recognition, though she knew that was impossible. Thank you, he said her name absent from his lips, but his voice holding the weight of something that felt like knowing. The rest of the drive was a blur of rain and shadow, and the occasional flash of headlights slicing the dark. And somewhere between the roar of the ocean and the creak of her cottage steps, Imelda realised she'd crossed an invisible line, the kind you can't uncross, no matter how many times you tell yourself you should. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the bones of the night. Inside the car, silence settled like a held breath. Imelda tightened her grip on the wheel, her heart punching at her ribs in a rhythm that didn't feel entirely her own. She didn't know who Richard Harris was or why his name sounded like a door cracking open on a room she'd never meant to enter. She only knew this chance meetings have a way of rewriting lives in a town like Bluewater Cove. And sometimes the night you choose to stop becomes the night that chooses you. Stay with us if this moment has pulled you in, if you've ever believed that one decision could change everything. Imelda and Richard's story is only beginning, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Tell us in the comments, would you have stopped that night? Like if you felt the storm, follow so you're here for every twist, every secret and every heartbeat still to come. The storm had settled into its rage like a beast curling around its own hunger, clawing at the night with rain and wind. By the time Imelda Ramirez turned down the narrow track that led to her cottage, the world had shrunk to darkness and the frantic drumming of water on steel. Her wipers carved an uneven rhythm across the windshield, each stroke a reminder that this was madness. She shouldn't have brought him here. Every instinct screamed it a clamour under her ribs louder than the storm. He was a stranger, a bleeding, secret-soaked stranger, and she was 8 months pregnant, carrying a life so fragile it sometimes felt like porcelain in her belly. But then she glanced sideways. Richard Harris sat slumped in the passenger seat, jaw set, as if that alone could anchor him, his shirt clinging wet and crimson where his hand pressed hard to his ribs. The glow from the dashboard limned his cheekbones in a sharp geometry of light and shadow. His lips were pale. Whatever pride kept him upright was bleeding as fast as the wound beneath his palm. Leaving him had never truly been an option. Not for a woman raised on her mother's creed. We help when we can. That's who we are. The tyres slid once on the rain-slick path before catching again, spitting gravel. Ahead the cottage crouched against the marsh like a weary sentinel paint weathered to a sullen blue porch, sagging under years of storms, a single light burning in the front room. She'd left it on that morning for company, though company had never been what she expected to find. Imelda eased the car to a stop, killing the engine. For a moment the quiet inside it felt immense, the silence of two people holding on to the same frayed thread for entirely different reasons. Rain rattled the roof like coins shaken in a tin. Richard exhaled the sound low, controlled. You live here? His voice was hoarse, worn raw by pain and weather, but something was in it, a texture that spoke of polished rooms and conversations spun from silver. I do. Imelda's fingers tightened around the keys before she dropped them into the cup holder. Not much, but it's what I've got. He turned his head then, and those green eyes found her even through exhaustion. For a breath she thought they might have softened, but perhaps that was the storm refracted in them, a trick of light and need. The baby shifted a small insistent tide inside her. Imelda opened the door. The wind slapped at her like a jealous lover, driving needles of rain under her collar. She braced a hand against the car, circling to the other side. Richard had one foot on the ground when she reached him, his breath a harsh metronome against the storm's percussion. Pride flickered in the line of his jaw, refusing the gravity that wanted him on his knees. I can manage, he said, though the effort of saying it carved a shadow down his cheek. You don't have to. Imelda's voice came steadier than she felt. Please give me your arm. For a heartbeat, pride and pain warred in the narrow green country of his gaze. Then he nodded once a concession, nothing more, and extended his forearm. Rain slicked his skin, ran in rivulets along the tendons. She hooked her hand through, anchoring her weight against his in a dance as old as survival. The porch groaned under them, the boards bending like weary bones. Imelda fumbled the key into the locked metal cold against her fingers and pushed the door wide. Warmth greeted them in a thin rush, what little the stubborn heater could coax into being. The air smelled faintly of lavender and damp wood, the ghosts of old storms whispering in the corners. Inside the room stilled as though listening, a couch softened by years of use. A second-hand bookshelf crouched against the wall, its spine a crooked smile of cookbooks and thrift store paperbacks. A lamp with a frayed shade casting light that seemed to fall in handfuls rather than sheets. Not much, but hers. She guided him across the threshold, his weight heavier now, as though the house had permitted him to surrender. The couch sighed beneath his body when he sank onto it, a low groan, like relief or warning. For a long beat the only sounds were the storm muttering against the windows, and their twin breaths, hers quick with strain, his frayed at the edges. Then Imelda spoke, because silence felt too much like a question she wasn't ready to answer. I have a first aid kit. She set her keys in the chipped ceramic bowl by the door. It's not much, but it'll stop the bleeding. Good enough, Richard murmured, eyes closing briefly, lashes dark crescents against skin gone too pale. Imelda moved with the efficiency born of long nights and small means. A towel from the linen shelf, the battered red kit from beneath the sink, a bowl of clean water. She laid them out on the coffee table like offerings, then knelt snapping on thin gloves that looked almost ceremonial in the lamplight. Before she touched him, she said, You should know I'm not a nurse. I've watched enough first aid videos to fake it, but if this needs stitches, I'll tell you. His voice was low, carved smooth by weariness. A flicker of wryness ghosted his mouth. And if it does, I'll argue from the passenger seat. Imelda almost smiled. Almost. She reached for the edge of his shirt, her fingers careful, reverent in their caution. The fabric peeled away with a soft sound, reluctant as if it were a secret being told. Beneath it his skin bore the brutal watercolour of violence, bruises blooming in shades of night, a gash along his ribs clean but deep as though the world had tried to carve him down to bone. Imelda's breath hitched sharp and silent. She dipped the gauze and pressed it gently to the wound. His body flinched, a tremor, contained by sheer will, but he didn't pull away. How? The words slipped out before she could leash it. Wrong place, wrong time. Richard watched her hands for a long beat, something unreadable moving behind his gaze. Rain glimmered at the curve of his lashes, or perhaps that was memory. Something like that, he said at last. She risked another question, her tone even as though neutrality could armour curiosity. Something that leaves you bleeding on the side of a coastal road in $1,000 suit. This time his exhale carried the faintest curl of amusement, bitter stranded. A meeting turned into an argument that became something less civilised. I got out, not gracefully. His eyes slid from hers, fixed on a point just beyond the lamp's halo. A hospital would complicate the story. Imelda pressed fresh gauze and felt the warmth of his pulse against her gloves. And the police? A pause. Then quiet as rain on glass would make it worse. She didn't push. She had learnt the cost of prying too deeply into other people's shadows. Still the questions hung like storm clouds. Who was he running from? What did it mean that his name Richard Harris felt like a note on some distant instrument inside her? She taped the bandage into place and sat back on her heels. "You'll live," she said. "Is that your official medical opinion?" His mouth curved, half a smile, half a scar. "It's my mother's." She used to say, a clean bandage and a night's rest could solve 90% of what the world throws at you. The other 10% needed prayer and stubbornness. His gaze held hers, green and unflinching. "Do you have both enough to get through tonight?" Imelda rose, feeling the tug at her lower back, a reminder that her body was no longer hers. She crossed to the narrow hallway and pulled an old shoebox from the top shelf of her closet. Inside, folded like a memory, she couldn't quite release, a faded t-shirt, soft as breath, and a pair of grey sweatpants that smelled faintly of laundry soap and thyme. Things that had belonged to no one for too long. Richard watched the rain drag its nails down the window pane when she returned. She set the clothes on the arm of the couch. "These should fit well enough," she said, eyes on the fabric, not on him. "I'll turn around." She did, giving him privacy that felt more intimate than if she'd stayed. The rustle of fabric behind her was a low music she tried not to hear. She focused on the ordinary, the hum of the heater, the tick of rain against the glass, the soft halo of the lamp catching the smudge of a fingerprint she'd meant to wipe days ago. When he said done, she turned. The transformation was slight but startling. Gone was the ruin of the suit, the stiff collar stained with salt and blood. What remained was a man, stripped to something lean and elemental strength, honed but muted now by exhaustion. The bandage at his ribs was a pale diagonal against skin bronzed by sun and shadow. His hair, dark and unruly, clung damp at the temples, framing eyes that seemed almost luminous in the soft light. Imelda swallowed words she hadn't even formed. "Tea," she asked instead, because it was the safest sentence in the world. "Yes," he said, and the way the syllables settled between them felt like a small surrender. She set water to boil in the kitchen, her hands steady through the tremor coiling under her skin. She chose chamomile, saved for nights threatening to break her, and spooned it into a chipped blue mug. The refrigerator hummed, and above it an ultrasound photo winked beneath a magnet shaped like a gull, a grainy arc, the shadow of a promise. When she returned, Richard was studying the bookshelf, fingertips grazing the worn spines of cookbooks and poems, as if these were artefacts in a language he once spoke. He turned as she offered the mug, his fingers brushing hers, with a heat that startled her, a spark against the cool hush of the room. "Chamomile," he said, a faint smile ghosting his mouth. "I used to drink this when I needed honesty." "Did it work?" "Sometimes," he said, "when I wanted it to." Silence folded around them, then not empty but taut like a thread drawn too fine. Beyond the windows the storm still raged impatient wild. Inside the air thickened with something that had nothing to do with weather. Richard lowered himself back onto the couch, his movements careful, measured. Imelda took the chair opposite the one she'd painted the pale green of sea glass, its surface chipped by years of salt air. For a while they sat in the low glow of the lamp, two strangers caught in the amber of a night. Neither had chosen their lives tilting toward an axis neither could name. And though Imelda told herself this was temporary, one night, one kindness and nothing more, somewhere in the quiet between the tick of the heater and the soft breath of rain, she felt the world shift, a fraction, a tremor, enough to know that when the storm passed, nothing would be quite the same again. The storm had spent itself between midnight and dawn, collapsing into a sullen drizzle that slicked the world in grey. By the time the first pale light pried at the edges of Bluewater Cove, the cottage was a hush of creaking beams and soft breaths, the sort of quiet that feels too deliberate, as though the house itself were holding its lungs. Imelda woke first, not with a start, but with that peculiar awareness when life shifts in the dark. For a few fragile seconds she lay still, her body curved around the swell of her belly, listening. The rain ticked against the window like a hesitant visitor. Somewhere in the marsh, a gull complained its cry, thin and distant. and beneath those sounds, closer, steadier, the low, even cadence of a man's breathing. She turned her head. Richard was still on the couch, one arm flung across his chest, the other draped toward the floor, as if he'd surrendered mid-battle. The borrowed t-shirt clung to the breadth of his shoulders, the soft fabric darkened where damp hair had bled into cotton. In sleep, his face had shed its defences. The sharpness dulled, leaving lines not of power but of fatigue, the kind carved by years of carrying something too heavy for too long. Imelda's throat tightened unexpectedly. It wasn't pity. She knew the taste of pity, knew how sour it turned on the tongue. This was something else, a recognition of the way exhaustion can hollow a person out until all that remains is truth. The baby shifted a slow tidal arc that made her exhale through her teeth. She eased upright, every movement measured against the tug in her lower back, and slid her feet into the slippers, waiting like patient dogs by the bed. Her robe frayed at the cuffs, soft, from 100 washes wrapped around her as she crossed the narrow hall into the living room. The lamp still burned low, haloing the space in amber. A mug sat on the table, its rim bruised with the shadow of dried chamomile. Beside it, the first aid kit closed like a sealed confession. Imelda crept out of habit more than necessity. Years of living alone had taught her silence the art of folding herself small so the house didn't echo with absence. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the gas tick catching like a breath drawn too sharply. Steam began its slow rise, curling into the cool air. When she turned, Richard was watching her. Not fully awake, his lashes still heavy, his body curved toward the cushions, but his eyes found her, through the soft fog of sleep, green and unguarded. The room felt smaller for an instant, the space between the stove and the sofa, telescoping into something intimate enough to feel like a touch. "Good morning," Imelda said, her voice quiet and shaped to fit the hush. He made a sound low in his throat, somewhere between assent and the ache of being pulled from a place offering a temporary truce. "What time is it? A little after 6? She poured boiling water over the waiting leaves, the steam lifting like a curtain. "You should rest more." Richard said, "I've rested enough for a man who doesn't usually stop moving," though the way he sank back against the cushions betrayed him. His eyes flicked toward the window where the marsh stretched like a grey-green quilt under a sky the colour of old pewter. "Storm's over, for now," she said, carrying the tea to him. "Bluewater weather has a mean streak. It likes to re-evaluate." He accepted the cup, their fingers grazing. Heat travelled up her arm, traitorous and swift, like a current she hadn't meant to step into. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, but weighted. Not the perfunctory courtesy of men who thank without thinking. This sounded like something rarer, an acknowledgement almost reluctant in its sincerity, as if the admission cost him. Imelda sank into the chair opposite, drawing the robe tighter. "You said a hospital would complicate things last night," she said after a pause. "What did you mean by that?" Richard studied the steam curling from his cup. For a long moment the only sound was the kettle's cooling tick and the far-off hush of retreating tide. "Complication," he said, finally, voice low, as the word men like me use when the truth is too sharp to name outright. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, lifting his gaze to hers. His eyes were shards of something precious and perilous in the softened light. "But it's the only one I can give right now." Imelda held his stare, searching for even a splinter of threat in its green depths. She found none. What she found instead unsettled her more, an honesty so stripped of pretense it felt almost indecent. She looked away first, not because she believed him, because she wanted to, and that was dangerous enough. The kettle gave a last hiss like a secret expiring. Imelda rose and busied herself by pouring another cup, the motions precise, her refuge in routine. Behind her, Richard's voice came again, softer this time, like he hadn't meant to let it out. "Do you have someone?" She turned the question, folding the air between them into something taut. Someone, a husband, partner. His gaze flicked almost imperceptibly to the swell beneath her robe, father of the child. Its bluntness struck like a cold draught. Imelda set the cup down slowly, her fingers steady by force of will. "No," she said, a single syllable clean as bone. Richard's jaw worked against words that wanted out but didn't belong in this room. "I didn't mean—" "You meant what everyone means when they ask," that she cut in, her tone calm, almost conversational. But inside, an old ache uncoiled the ache of whispers in supermarket aisles, of pity disguised as politeness. And no, there's no one. The truth sat between them like a third presence breathing. Richard inclined his head, a gesture that looked like an apology without the indignity of saying it. He sipped his tea, the tendons in his forearm shifting like undercurrents. Imelda lowered herself back into the chair, pulse evening out one notch at a time. Outside, the sky was paling, surrendering its last scrap of night. Light slipped along the edges of the marsh, thin as silver wire. "Why were you out there?" she asked quietly, because silence was starting to feel like permission for thoughts she couldn't afford. Richard set the cup down with care. His fingers lingered on the porcelain rim, a man tracing the lip of a wound he didn't want to show. "Because someone decided I needed reminding that power doesn't make you untouchable." His mouth curved not in humour but in the bleak echo of it. They weren't wrong. Imelda's brows knit, the instinctive protest rising before she could stop it. What kind of world sends men like this, built of polish and command, bleeding into backroads like hunted things? But the answer was already there, folded into his tone. A world where empires drew blood behind boardroom doors, where money sharpened loyalty into a blade. She wanted to ask more. About the meeting, an argument became this. About who had marked him with bruises like constellations only fists could map. But the questions crowded her throat, jostling for a space they hadn't earned. Instead, she said, "You should keep that bandage dry, a retreat into the safe country of practical things." His smile was faint, but it reached his eyes this time, softening their winter into something almost like spring. "Yes, Mum." The kettle cooled, the light strengthened, and the quiet, far from thinning, deepened, threaded through now, with something unnamed making the room feel smaller and infinite. The storm's fingerprints lingered in puddles and power flickers by late morning. Imelda moved through the cottage with a restlessness she disguised as purpose, collecting towels from the line she'd strung in the hallway, setting a pot of soup to simmer, folding the borrowed clothes he'd shed, like the remnants of a life she didn't know how to picture. Richard drifted between the sofa and the window, his presence too large for the modest room, yet curiously at ease. Once she caught him studying the ultrasound photo on the fridge, his expression unreadable, as if passing the shape of a future he had no claim to. "You're quiet," she said, finally breaking the simmer and silence. "I was taught," he replied, his tone almost musing, "that silence makes people show themselves." His gaze slid to hers, steady as a held breath. "But it only makes me wonder more. Wonder what it costs you," Richard said, "to keep standing when the world keeps trying to knock you sideways." The words struck like a hand laid flat against her back, not harsh but firm enough to make her feel the weight she carried. She turned away, stirring the soup, though it didn't need stirring. "It costs what it costs," she said, because naming the price would make her feel it, and feeling it might break something she couldn't afford to lose. Behind her the floor creaked. A pause. Then his voice lower now, like a thread pulled through velvet. "You shouldn't have to pay it alone." The spoon stilled in her hand. Heat bloomed in her chest, unsettling as the first gust of a storm. She wanted to laugh, to slice through the moment with something light, but her throat had other plans. It closed around words she didn't trust herself to speak. When she finally turned, Richard watched her with that same quiet intensity, as if the space between them were not measured in feet, but in choices, each one small, each seismic. And in that gaze, Imelda felt the truth like a tide. Last night had been an accident, but this was the start of something that would demand reckoning. The marsh wind rattled the windows, soft, now almost tender. Somewhere beyond the grey horizon, sunlight waited, but the air was thick in the room, with a different weather one no forecast could name. The day settled into a brittle sort of brightness that followed a storm, as if to remind the world what could be taken for granted. Bluewater Cove wore the aftermath like a confession puddles, reflecting an anemic sky marsh grass bent in submission, shingles scattered like playing cards along the roadside. Imelda tied her apron in a double knot, fingers tugging harder than necessary. The Blue Lantern diner was already humming its narrow aisles, threading between booths that smelled of coffee and fried batter, the air thick with chatter about downed power lines and overturned skiffs. Conversations skimmed like stones across the surface of things, safe, predictable small-town talk. She could almost believe yesterday had been a fever dream. Almost. But then the bell over the door jingled, and her body betrayed her, an infinitesimal shift in posture, a tightening low in her belly that had nothing to do with the child pressing against her ribs. She kept her gaze steady on the coffee pot, as if black liquid could anchor her. It wasn't him. Just Mr. Holloway from the bait shop shook rain from his cap and grumbled about tourists who didn't know a riptide from a ripcord. Relief washed through her, with a sting sharp enough to shame her. What had she expected Richard Harris would stroll into this diner like any other man slide into a vinyl booth and order eggs over easily? Men like him didn't belong in places like this. They belonged to worlds, upholstered in power and soft light, where a single word could tilt fortunes. And yet last night he'd sat on her sagging couch drinking tea from a chipped mug, his voice threading through the quiet like something warm enough to thaw marrow. He'd said things that lodged under her skin about cost solitude and not paying a price alone. Words she hadn't asked for or knew she needed until they settled like embers in the dark. Immy. The nickname tugged her back. Renee Collins stood at the pass-through, sliding a plate of pecan pie onto the counter with a flourish. Her friend's eyes sharp as oyster shells and twice as hard to fool narrowed. "You're a million miles out," Renee said, low enough not to carry. "Storm didn't take you with it." Imelda forced a smile that tasted like cardboard. "Just tired." Uh-huh. Renee wiped her hands on a rag, leaning in. Funny kind of tired that makes a girl stare at the door like it owes her money. Imelda opened her mouth, denial polished and ready, but the bell chimed again, and this time the world tilted. He didn't belong here. Every line of his said so. The slate grey coat, the dark sweater, soft enough to whisper, of Italian looms, the boots that had never seen a muddy marsh path. And yet there he was, framed in the doorway, like a question the room didn't know how to answer. Conversations faltered, reshaped themselves into murmurs. Forks hovered mid-air. Even the neon clock above the pie case seemed to pause. Richard's gaze found hers, and for a moment the diner fell away. The formica tables, the hiss of the fryer, the hum of gossip flattening into static. There was only the green weight of his eyes and the sharp staccato of her pulse. He crossed the room without hurry, but with that kind of certainty a man accustomed to space parting for him. When he reached the counter, he didn't glance at the menu or anyone but her. "Morning," he said, his voice a low current she felt more than heard. Imelda gripped the coffee pot like a talisman. "You shouldn't be here. Good to see you too." The corner of his mouth edged towards something that might have been a smile in a gentler universe. She said, "This isn't your world," quiet but firm, hoping the words would sound like a wall and not the prayer they were. Maybe not. His tone carried no argument, only an undercurrent that made her breath snag. "But you are..." The words landed like pebbles dropped into a still pond, sending ripples she couldn't stop. From the corner of her eye she saw Renee watching, arms folded, curiosity sharpening like a blade. Saw old Mrs. Penfield's head tilt, her pearls trembling with the force of whatever theory she was about to birth, and cradle like gospel. The air thickened heavy with the scent of speculation. Imelda leaned in, her voice clipped. "What do you want, Richard?" His reply was silk over steel. 5 minutes. Somewhere that isn't here. Before she could frame a refusal, Renee materialised her smile bright enough to see her. "Immy, why don't you take your break? I've got the floor." Imelda shot her a look that promised retribution. Renee answered with a wink that promised pleasure in earning it. With no weapon left but dignity, Imelda untied her apron and gestured toward the back door. Richard followed the hush of eyes clinging like burrs. The alley behind the diner smelled of salt and damp cardboard. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries slicing the pale sky. Imelda turned, folding her arms to keep from folding altogether. "Talk," she said. Richard studied her for a beat, hands in his coat pockets, posture loose, but threaded with a tension that hummed like a high wire. "You left this morning without letting me thank you. You just did. Not for the tea or the couch, for trusting me enough to stop last night." His gaze held hers, green and relentless. "That isn't nothing." Her laugh was low, sharp. "You think gratitude explains why you're standing in my world, making half the town lick their lips for gossip? I think gratitude's the wrong word." He stepped closer, not crowding, just claiming a sliver more of the fragile space between them. "I guess curiosity comes closer. About me, about why a woman who owes nothing to a bleeding stranger still opened her door. Why does that feel like the first honest thing that's happened to me in a long time?" The words slipped under her skin, hot and disorienting. Imelda swallowed hard. "You should leave, Richard. Whatever storm put you on that road, it's not done. And I can't afford to be in its path." His jaw tightened, a flicker of something dangerous passing through his gaze. "You think distance will keep you safe? I know it will keep me standing." For a moment neither moved. The wind worried at her hair, tangling strands like threads pulled loose from a seam. Richard's eyes traced her face with a focus that felt like a vow, quiet, unspeakable, the kind that builds its own gravity. Then he stepped back, the retreat controlled, deliberate, if that's what you want. It wasn't. God help her, it wasn't. But what had never paid the bills silenced the whispers, or stitched a fractured life. She turned without answering, fingers biting crescents into her palms. When she slipped inside, the diner's heat hit like a slap. So did the looks, some curious, some knowing, all loud in their silence. By the time her shift ended, the rumours had sprouted legs. They came first as murmurs, conversation threads snatched from the air like errant strands of wool. Did you see that car? The one that looks like it costs more than this whole block. He called her by name. Did you hear? Not from around here. Not with those shoes. By dusk the hum had grown teeth. Renee caught her by the arm near the stockroom, eyes bright with something between mischief and warning. Spill, she demanded. Who is he? And don't you dare say nobody. I've seen nobodies and they don't come wrapped in cashmere with cheekbones sharp enough to slice bread. Imelda sagged against a crate of napkins, fatigue gnawing at her bones. He's someone I helped, that's all. That's all. Renee arched a brow. Honey, half the town thinks you've rescued a movie star and the other half's betting on a fugitive. You want to correct the narrative. Imelda pressed a hand to her belly as if the weight there could anchor her against the swell of speculation. Let them think what they want. But Bluewater Cove wasn't a town that thought quietly. By the time she walked home under a sky the colour of tarnished silver, her name was already wearing a new shape in other people's mouths. The cottage crouched at the marsh's edge, its porch light smudged by mist. Imelda's keys rattled like guilty bones in her hand as she climbed the steps. She told herself the unease coiling in her gut was fatigue, nothing more. Then she saw it, parked at the curb like a sentinel, a brand new SUV, its paint the deep blue of midnight seas, its chrome winking under the weak glow of the street lamp. The leather seats glimmered through the glass, pale as bone. Imelda's breath stalled. She stepped closer, the gravel biting under her soles, and that's when she saw the envelope resting on the driver's seat, her name inked in a hand that was both precise and unhurried. Inside a single note. For the night you didn't look away, no strings. And beneath it $10,000 in crisp bills. The air seemed to thin, sharp as the edge of a blade. Imelda stood very still, the weight of the envelope absurd against the smallness of her kitchen keys, clenched in her fist. This wasn't gratitude. Gratitude doesn't come dressed in temptation and is parked outside your life like a question you couldn't stop asking. Somewhere beyond the marsh, thunder rumbled a sound too distant to belong to the weather. And in that moment, Imelda understood storms didn't always announce themselves with wind and rain. Some arrived on four wheels, polished and patient, waiting for you to open the door. The envelope lay on the kitchen counter, like a trespasser white against the worn wood, its edges crisp, its promise louder than any thunder. Imelda had set it there the night before, unopened for hours, because touching it felt like fire. But curiosity had teeth, and eventually they bit deep. The note had been simple. For the night you didn't look away. No strings. $10,000. Stacked like quiet temptation, each bill smelling faintly of ink and decisions that could break a life in two. Imelda stared at it now in the pale light of morning, her fingers curled around a chipped mug as if ceramic could anchor her. The baby shifted inside her, a rolling tide that made her robe strain across her belly. She pressed her free hand there, steadying herself, steadying them both. What would a woman with sense do? Take the money, return it, pretend it had never crossed her threshold. What would her mother have done? The question cut deeper than she expected because the answer came quick and sure. Her mother would have seen it for what it was. Not charity, not even gratitude, but power disguised as benevolence. And power, her mother always said, was never free. A knock broke the thought, like glass 3 sharp raps against the wood firm enough to claim space. Imelda's pulse climbed. She carefully set the mug down, wiped her palms on her robe and opened the door. Richard stood on the porch, the wind combed through his hair, tugging at his charcoal coat's collar. He looked composed, but there was an edge this morning, something coiled beneath the polish. A tension braided tight through every line of his frame. His eyes found hers green and bright against the grey wash of day. "May I come in?" Imelda hesitated, remembering last night's envelope, whispering like a ghost between them. Then she stepped aside because denying him would have felt like trying to dam a river with her bare hands. Richard entered with a quiet authority, the room seeming to contract around him. His gaze swept once over the cottage, the worn sofa, the thin curtains, the faint scent of lavender still clinging from last night. His jaw ticked once when his eyes landed on the counter, on the envelope lying like an accusation. "You saw it," he said. "Not a question." "I saw it," she replied evenly, and Imelda folded her arms as shield against the weight of his presence. And I told myself that a man who thinks he can leave money like that on a woman's doorstep doesn't know her. Something flickered across his face. Not anger, not quite surprise, but something more elusive, a shadow of respect. perhaps sharp as a blade's gleam. "Then tell me," he said quietly, "what would you have me do instead? Start with not trying to buy absolution." His lips curved, not into a smile, but into that near smile that felt like it belonged to a man who'd forgotten how to be amused. That wasn't absolution, Imelda. That was acknowledgement. She said acknowledgement doesn't come in stacks of hundreds, heating her tone now. It comes in words, in actions that don't make me feel like a problem you're trying to solve. Richard's eyes held hers unblinking. "You're not a problem. You're the only thing in the last 72 hours that doesn't feel like one." The words landed in the hollow behind her ribs, sharp and sweet, and she hated the way they made her chest tighten. Before she could reply, he reached into his coat and drew a slim black envelope, sleek, elegant, embossed with silver script. He set it on the counter beside the white one. "What's that, an invitation?" he said. "There's a winter gala in Charleston tomorrow night. Charity event. Coastal Wildlife Foundation." She stared at him. "And you're asking me because I want you there," Richard said. No flourish, no apology, just that unyielding steadiness that made her feel like the floor had shifted beneath her. Imelda let out a low, incredulous laugh. "You think I belong at some chandeliered circus where women glide around in gowns that cost more than this house?" He said, his voice dropping to something quieter, sharper, that you belong anywhere you stand. "And if that's beside me for one night, I want that." The room seemed to hold its breath. The kettle on the stove began to murmur a thin, plaintive sound. "I don't have anything to wear to a gala," she said finally, because practicality was safer than admitting the way his words had sliced through every defence she owned. His answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll take care of it." Her chin lifted. "That sounds a lot like strings." "No," Richard said, stepping closer, the faint scent of rain and cedar sweeping in with him. "It sounds like a gift. One night. No more. One night." The phrase curled through her like smoke. One night to step out of a life stitched with scarcity. One night to taste a world that had never once invited her in. One night, and then what? She looked at the envelope, black as a secret, gleaming under the dull kitchen light. Her reflection wavered faintly in its sheen, a woman standing at the fault line between sense and surrender. "Why me?" The question escaped before she could catch it, raw as exposed nerve. Richard's gaze didn't waver. "Because when I was bleeding in the rain, you didn't see a name or a headline. You saw a man and stopped. Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Imelda swallowed her throat tight. The kettle's whisper grew louder, curling steam into the air like a question mark. She should say no. She should end this here before it becomes something she can't control. But control, she realised with a shiver, was already a ghost. The dress arrived at dawn. Imelda found it on the porch, sealed in a box long enough to cradle dreams. Tissue paper parted under her fingers like a sigh, revealing a sweep of midnight silk that shimmered even in the meek light creeping through the curtains. The neckline was modest, but the cut spoke a language of elegance she'd never learned, clean lines that promised grace without pleading for attention. Beneath it, in a smaller box, silver earrings shaped like teardrops, each holding a light pinprick. She stood there for a long moment, the fabric pulled in her hands as if weight and wonder could coexist. Then she folded it back into its nest of tissue and closed the lid because staring at it too long felt dangerous. At the cafe, Renee cornered her before she'd even tied her apron. "Don't bother lying," her friend said, eyes bright with mischief. "Word is Charleston's about to meet Bluewater's best kept secret." Imelda shot her a look sharp enough to slice bread. "Word needs to mind its own business." "Word's just jealous," Renee countered. Then softer. "You sure about this, Immy?" "His kind of world. It chews girls like us for breakfast." Imelda's throat tightened. "It's just one night." Renee's smile curved knowing and sad all at once. That's what every story says before it stops being just. Charleston shimmered under a frost-edged dusk, its historic facades draped in garlands and jewelled with light. The Harris name opened doors like a key forged from old money and newer influence. Imelda felt their weight with every step across the marble floor of the waterfront mansion. Crystal chandeliers spilled radiance like melted stars. Music drifted a string quartet threading Bach through the murmur of voices pitched in that register where wealth disguises hunger as charm. Women glided in gowns that whispered of couture ateliers. Men wore confidence like bespoke armour. And then there was her. The midnight dress clung like shadow, and water, the silver at her ears catching the chandelier's gleam. Her curls framed her face in soft defiance, and when she met her eyes in the mirror before leaving, she'd seen something startling there. Not disbelief, but a flicker of belonging she hadn't known she could feel. Richard moved beside her like a man born to this orbit command, tempered by a restraint that felt deliberate tonight. His hand hovered at the small of her back, not claiming just steadying a silent axis in a room spinning with speculation. Heads turned as they passed. Glances slid like knives sheathed in silk. "You're causing a riot," she muttered, her smile a brittle curve. "They'll live," he said, his tone a dark thread of amusement. They stopped at a table draped in white linen silver cutlery glinting like tiny weapons. Across the room she caught the flick of a gaze, female assessing edged in something sharper than curiosity. The woman approached minutes later, champagne satin pooling around her like liquid ambition. "Richard," she said, her voice honeyed steel. "I didn't realise you were bringing company." His reply was smooth as poured whiskey. "Imelda Ramirez, Victoria Ames." Victoria's handshake was cool, her smile a sculpture polished for galleries. "Lovely to meet you. How do you two know each other?" Imelda opened her mouth, but Richard's voice slid in calm and unflinching. "She saved my life." It was the truth, but the way he said it, low, deliberate, drew a hush sharper than crystal. Victoria's brows arched, curiosity flickering like a blade catching light. "Interesting," she murmured, before drifting away on a tide of silk and secrets. Imelda turned to him, pulse hammering. "You didn't have to say it like that." Richard said, "I meant it like that," his gaze anchoring hers until the room blurred at the edges. Later, as they stepped out into the cold night air, the mansion's windows glowing like a constellation behind them, Imelda felt the echo of chandeliers still clinging to her skin. She had walked through a world that had never been hers, and somehow, for a few hours, had worn it without breaking. Beside her, Richard opened the car door, the gesture quiet, almost reverent. When she met his eyes across the roof, something passed between them, a current neither of them named, but both felt in the marrow. As the car glided along the dark ribbon of highway, back toward Bluewater, silence settled, not brittle but deep-layered with everything unsaid. Imelda turned her face to the window, watching the night slip by in smears of silver and shadow, her reflection ghosting back at her. One night she told herself just one, but the lie tasted sweeter than the truth. Morning arrived, draped in gauze grey fog, softening the jagged edges of Charleston's skyline and washing the marshland in pearl light. But nothing could soften the sharpness of what trailed Imelda home from the gala, the weight of eyes, the prickle of speculation, the quiet sense that her life had tilted on an axis she couldn't name. Bluewater Cove wasn't built for secrets. It was a town where lives were stitched together by proximity and whispers travelled faster than the tide. And by the time Imelda walked into Harper's diner for her morning shift, the current had already begun to pull. The bell chimed as she entered, and conversation hiccuped a microsecond pause, subtle as the flick of a blade before it cuts. Then voices resumed, but lighter, frothier, like foam disguising the undertow. Heads bent towards steaming mugs, glances flicked sideways. Imelda felt them all pricking her skin like burrs. She tied her apron with fingers that refused to tremble. The baby rolled under her ribs, a slow, insistent reminder of the life anchored inside her, even as everything else threatened to drift. Renee appeared behind the counter, eyes bright with questions and a faint, dangerous grin. She said, sliding a plate of biscuits toward a regular without breaking eye contact, "If it isn't Bluewater's own Cinderella." Imelda's mouth flattened. "Don't start." "Oh, I'm not starting, honey," Renee drawled. "The town began 3 hours ago. I'm just trying to catch up." Imelda shot her a look sharp enough to cut through gossip like salt through cream. "It was a charity event." That's all. Renee leaned in, voice pitched low but thrumming with mischief. "Funny, because you floated into that ballroom looking like a sin even Sunday couldn't forgive." And she let the pronoun linger heavy as a stone dropped in water, looking like he owned the moon and loaned it out for the night. Imelda turned away, busying herself with a coffee pot that didn't need filling, but the heat in her cheeks betrayed her, blooming in hues she couldn't hide. Behind her, Renee's voice softened. "Immy, be careful." The words curled under her ribs, heavy as an anchor, because caution had always been her creed, yet last night, under the spill of chandeliers and the weight of Richard's gaze, caution had felt like a foreign language she'd forgotten to speak. She didn't see him again for 2 days. Not in the diner, her porch, or the narrow streets that ribbed the cove like an old quilt. It should have been a relief, that distance. Instead it gnawed, slow patient like a tide, eating at the pilings beneath a house. By the third day, the quiet was fractured. It happened at dusk when the sky was a bruised, bleeding lavender and the marsh smelled of salt and secrets. Imelda was locking the diner's back door when a car eased into the alley, a low purr of an engine, too sleek, too restrained to belong to this zip code. Richard stepped out before she could form a thought. No coat this time, just a black sweater that clung to the geometry of his shoulders, dark trousers tailored within an inch of sin. His presence bent the dim light toward him like iron to a magnet. "We need to talk," he said. Imelda's pulse stuttered. She gripped the keyring tighter, metal biting her palm. "About what, the SUV, the envelope, or the fact that half the town thinks I'm—" She broke off breath. Sharp. "What do you want from me, Richard?" His gaze held hers, green and steady, a depth that dared her to look away. "The truth," he said, "and the chance to give you mine." Something in his tone, low, stripped of varnish, made her step back just enough for the cold to sneak under her sweater. "Then talk. Not here." His glance swept the alley, the shadows crouching like eavesdroppers. "Please." The word snagged her breath because men like him didn't say please. Not unless they meant it. Imelda hesitated. Every instinct screamed to walk away, to barricade herself behind the familiar fortress of no. But then she thought of the photograph still pinned to her refrigerator, the grainy arc of a future curling in black and white, and something in her loosened like a knot pulled by an unseen hand. "Fine," she said. 5 minutes. He drove silently the road, unspooling like a dark ribbon under the car's muted hum. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and leather, threaded with a note that was all him, clean, understated, expensive, without effort. Imelda sat rigid, her hands knotted in her lap, watching the world blur into smears of silver and shadow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I didn't mean for any of this to touch you." Imelda let out a short, brittle laugh. "You show up in a town like this, Richard, bleeding all over Highway 17, and you think it wouldn't—" "I should have known better," he said. But that night, he broke off, jaw flexing as if the words tasted like iron. "That night, I wasn't thinking about consequences. I was thinking about surviving." The honesty in it sliced through her defences, sharp and sudden. She turned, studying the hard planes of his profile, the muscle ticking near his temple. "Who did that to you?" His fingers tightened on the wheel, knuckles blanching. "Someone who thinks leverage is the only language worth speaking. Someone who'd use what happened to destroy everything I've built." And now her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are they still coming?" "Yes." The single syllable dropped like a stone in a well, vanishing into a depth she didn't want to measure. "And they'll come harder now, because last week I made a choice they didn't like. A choice that cost them millions." Imelda's stomach dipped, cold sluicing through her veins. "And what does that have to do with me?" "Nothing," Richard said too quickly. Then softer, everything. Because the minute you pulled over that night and opened your door, you became the one variable they didn't account for. And men like that. He exhaled a thread of sound frayed by rage. "They don't like variables." Imelda stared at him, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. "So what now? You disappear? Or do I?" His gaze cut to hers, fierce and unflinching. "Neither. I won't run, and I won't let them use you to make me crawl." Something in his tone, dark diamond hard, made her throat tighten. She turned away, watching the marsh slide past in ghosted silhouettes. Silence pulled between them, thick as oil, until Richard spoke again. Softer now, the edge dulled but not gone. "Come with me just for a while. I have a place in the mountains, private, secure. You can breathe there. No eyes, no whispers." Imelda almost laughed, the sound catching on a sob she refused to let fall. "You think hiding fixes this? Staying here paints a target on your back," he said. "And I can't." He stopped, his hands tightening on the wheel. "I can't watch that happen." The rawness in his voice scraped something open inside her. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the soft kick, like punctuation against a sentence she hadn't finished writing. Safety wasn't a luxury anymore. It was oxygen for her, for the child she carried like a secret folded in bone. And yet trusting him meant stepping off the edge of everything familiar into a world where power didn't play by rules, a world she had glimpsed under chandeliers and felt pressing cold against her throat. "Give me tonight," she said finally, her voice flat with exhaustion. "I'll think about it." Richard's jaw worked, but he nodded once the movement taut as wire. "Tonight." He brought her home without another word. When the SUV rolled to a stop outside her cottage, the silence between them was so thick it might have been tangible, a wall they both leaned against, too brittle to climb. Imelda reached for the door handle. His voice stopped her. "Imelda, She turned. His eyes held hers across the dim space green, fractured by something she didn't want to name. "I wasn't lying," he said quietly, "about why I asked you to the gala, about any of it." The truth in his tone slammed against her ribs, dizzying as a riptide. She nodded once because anything more would have cracked her open and stepped out into the night. The air smelled of brine and cold stars. Behind her, the SUV idled a beat too long before gliding away, its taillights fading like embers swallowed by dark. That night, sleep came in shards, jagged and restless. When it finally broke, it was to the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand, its glow slicing the dark like a blade. A message. No name, just a number she didn't recognise. And beneath it, 2 images. The first, her and Richard on her porch laughing over a paper bag of pastries, his head bent close enough to brush her curls. The second, a scan of an old hospital report bearing her name. The date is stamped 5 years ago, the words concussion and contusions, and beneath them a line of text that made her blood run cold. "Tell him before I do." The phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the quilt with a muted thud. For a long, wild heartbeat, she could only stare at the ceiling, her pulse clawing at her throat. The past she'd buried was clawing back teeth, bared, dragging with it every secret she'd vowed would never surface. Outside, the marsh wind moaned against the eaves like something old and hungry. Inside, Imelda pressed both hands over her belly and whispered a prayer to a God she hoped still listened, not for miracles, but for the strength to walk through whatever storm was coming next. Because this wasn't the kind of weather you could outrun. The night bled into morning without mercy. Imelda stood at the kitchen sink, both hands braced against the counter, as if wood could bear the weight her body couldn't. Outside, the marsh wore its winter hush, silvered reeds bowing under a sky bruised purple and grey. Inside, her phone lay on the table screen, black now but still pulsing in her mind with that single message. "Tell him before I do." The threat curled like smoke through the small cottage, seeping into corners, clinging to the quiet. She'd thought she'd buried that night so deep it couldn't claw its way back, not through years, not through distance, not through the marrow-deep resolve that had carried her from Wilmington to Bluewater Cove, with nothing but a suitcase and a spine of iron. But ghosts, she realised, don't rot. They wait. Her reflection wavered in the window, a woman carved from fatigue, and something sharper fear wearing the thin disguise of composure. The baby shifted beneath her ribs, a tidal roll that stole her breath. She pressed a hand there, grounding herself against the only certainty left. Behind her, the floor creaked. "Couldn't sleep," Renee's voice drifted from the doorway, hushed but edged with steel. Imelda turned, swallowing the instinct to paste on a smile. Renee leaned against the jamb, her curls pulled into a defiant knot, eyes sharp enough to flay excuses. "You didn't call," Renee said, crossing the room in 3 strides. "Which means it's bad." How bad? Imelda gestured toward the table. The phone glowed awake at Renee's touch, throwing its venom in pixels across the dim kitchen. Renee read in silence. Once. Twice. Then her breath hissed out a sound like steam escaping. "Son of a..." She broke off, pacing a tight line between stove and sink. "Who sent this? I don't know," Imelda said. Her voice was steady, but only because panic had already burned through to ash. "But I can guess." "Malik!" Renee spat the name like a curse. Imelda closed her eyes. Not Daniel. Not the man in the photographs tucked in some memory drawer, all crooked smiles and half promises. Malik. Her pulse stuttered at the thought of his face, the one she hadn't seen in nearly 3 years, except in dreams where regret took shape and grinned. "He was always slick," Renee muttered, planting her hands on her hips and always sniffing for an angle. But this, using Daniel's ghost, that's low even for him. Imelda sank into a chair, the wood biting cold through her robe. "He knows what that report means. He knows what people believed, that you were driving," Renee said grimly. "You killed him." The words landed like stones, heavy and absolute. Imelda felt them in her bones the way she'd felt every headline that twisted truth into something sharp enough to cut her life clean in two. "I tried to stop him," she whispered, the confession spilling out raw. "He'd been drinking and God, Renee, I thought if I got in the car I could make him pull over." Instead, the memory surged vivid as the moment it branded her, the screech of tyres, the kaleidoscope spin of headlights, the tree trunk lunging out of darkness like a fist. The silence after was thick with the taste of blood and disbelief. "You don't have to explain to me," Renee said, crouching so her eyes levelled with Imelda's. "But if this hits the wind, if Richard hears it from anyone but you..." Imelda flinched. "I can't tell him," she said. "Not now. Not when his world is already collapsing in ways I don't understand. You think you're protecting him? Renee's voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. Secrets don't shield people, Imi. They shatter them. The truth of it coiled tight, but before Imelda could shape a reply, the sound of tyres crunching gravel sliced through the morning quiet. Both women froze. Renee moved first, striding to the window and peeling back the curtain. Well, she said flatly, speak of the devil, or the man who might as well own the road. Imelda's stomach dropped. Richard. He stood at the edge of the porch when she opened the door, the grey sky pooling silver over his shoulders. His coat collar was turned up against the cold, but the chill in his expression had nothing to do with the weather. Good morning, she managed, gripping the doorframe like driftwood in a flood. We need to talk, he said. His voice was quiet, but the steel threaded through it made her shiver. About what her pulse hammered, every muscle braced for a blow she couldn't name. He studied her for a beat, his gaze sweeping her face, her eyes the tremor she couldn't quite hide about why someone tried to leak your hospital records last night. The words slammed into her, knocking air from her lungs. You how I have people, Richard said, stepping closer. Not menacing, but inexorable like a tide. People who watch for knives aimed at my back, and apparently yours. Ice sluiced through her veins. So, you know. I know enough to ask you this. His eyes burned into hers, green fractured by something darker. Is there anything else coming for you, Imelda? Anything I need to clean up before it drowns us both? The way he said drowns made her throat close. It's not what you think, she whispered. Then tell me what to think, he shot back the words, slicing through the cold like a blade. Behind him the marsh wind keened, carrying the taste of salt and storms. Imelda gripped the edge of the door harder, feeling splinters bite her palm. 5 years ago, she began, and the words felt like rust cracking loose. I was engaged. His name was Daniel Clark. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, a flash of recognition, sharp and fleeting. Clark, he echoed, his tone unreadable. We were driving home from a bar. Imelda went on each syllable like a stone pried from her chest. He'd been drinking. I begged him to let me drive. He laughed. We argued. I thought if I stayed in the car I could keep him from killing himself. Or someone else. Her breath snagged on the memory's jagged edge. I was wrong. The silence that followed was brutal, vast as the sky. Richard's face didn't move, but something in it, something vital, shifted. The report said I was driving. Imelda whispered. They said I killed him. His family made sure the papers ran it that way. Because the truth, her voice cracked raw as torn silk, the truth didn't fit their narrative of a golden boy gone too fast. And the truth, Richard said slowly, is that you lived while he didn't, which for people like them is unforgivable. Her gaze jerked to his, startled by its precision. How do you know that? Because his mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something colder, almost feral. Because I know the Clarks. The name hung between them like a match poised over oil. Imelda's pulse skittered. You knew Daniel, knew him. Richard's laugh was low and humourless. No. But I know his father, his brothers. And if Malik's the one circling you now, he broke off a muscle ticking in his jaw, then this isn't about gossip. It's about leverage. The realisation slammed into her with the force of a surf. You think they're using me to get to you? I don't think Richard said. I know. Imelda gripped the doorframe until her knuckles blanched. So what now? You put me in a glass box until the storm passes. No, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre. I take you somewhere they can't reach you, where you and that baby... His gaze flicked briefly to the swell beneath her sweater, then back softer now, but no less fierce. Are safe. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings. You're asking me to disappear. I'm asking you to live, Richard said, and then quieter, like a vow pressed into skin with me. The words stole the air from her lungs. She stared at him, at the man who'd crashed into her life like a storm, and now stood offering sanctuary wrapped in shadows. The rational thing, the only thing, was to say no. To slam the door on this man, this world, this spiral with no bottom. But when Imelda opened her mouth, the word dissolved on her tongue. Because somewhere beneath the fear, fury and fractured pieces of her past, something else pulsed, wild, insistent, unyielding as a tide. Want. And God helped her. It was stronger than sense. That night she packed. Not much clothes folded into a battered duffel, the ultrasound photo plucked from the fridge like a relic, the tiny cotton onesies she'd bought secretly on nights when hope outweighed hunger. Renee hovered in the doorway, arms crossed tight enough to cut off blood. You sure about this? No, Imelda said. zipping the bag with hands that didn't quite shake. But I don't have another choice. Renee exhaled sharp and resigned. Then go. And call me. Or I swear, Immy, I'll track you down and drag you home by your hair. Imelda almost smiled. Almost. When she stepped outside, the air smelled of salt and endings. Richard was waiting by the SUV, its paint glinting like wet ink under the porch light. He took the bag without a word, his hand brushing hers in a fleeting spark that lit every nerve. As she slid into the passenger seat, the marsh wind rose behind them, lifting a chorus of whispers that chased the car down the darkened road. Hours later, the highway gave way to mountains, a jagged spine carved against a sky black enough to swallow secrets. Pines crowded close as their shadows pooling like spilled ink across the snow-laced ground. Richard turned off the main road onto a winding track that climbed and curled the SUV's headlights, cleaving through mist like blades. And then through the trees it appeared a cabin crouched at the lake's edge, its stone chimney exhaling smoke into the frozen air, its windows glowing gold against the dark like promises, too fragile to speak aloud. Imelda's breath caught. Not at the grandeur, it wasn't that though the cabin whispered of quiet wealth in the heft of its timber and the gleam of its glass, but at the stillness, the sense that the world had dropped away, leaving only this a place where time could fold in on itself and start again. Richard cut the engine. For a moment neither moved. Then he turned his eyes, catching the glow from the porch light, green deepening into something that felt like gravity. "You're safe now," he said. The words should have sounded like an ending. Instead they felt like the start of something that might undo them both. Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals, each flake catching the glow from the cabin windows before vanishing into the dark. Inside, warmth pooled like honey, thick and golden, humming from the hearth where flames licked at split logs. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something subtler, like citrus, trailing the edges of smoke. Imelda stood just inside the threshold, her duffel dangling from limp fingers. The room yawned before her, vaulted beams ribbing the ceiling, a stone fireplace anchoring one wall, leather chairs softened by time and velvet throws. A wide window stretched toward the lake, black now, its surface locked under glassy ice that held the moon like a bruise. "Safe," Richard had said. The words still clung to her skin, fragile as frost. She set the bag down, easing the weight from her shoulder, and let her gaze drift over shelves lined with books whose spines whispered of worlds far from this one, over a table scarred by the faint ghosts of old meals and older arguments. This wasn't a house built for spectacle. It was a fortress disguised as warmth. Imelda. Her name, shaped low and deliberate, pulled her back. Richard stood a few feet away, framed by the door. He'd just bolted his coat, slung over one arm. Without it, he seemed sharper somehow, his lines honed by shadow and firelight, his black sweater clinging to angles, hinting at strength beneath restraint. "You're staring," he said. Not accusation, observation wrapped in something quieter. She murmured, "It doesn't look like the kind of place a man keeps for running." His mouth curved not into a smile, but into that restrained half thing that made her pulse skip. "That's because I don't run. Not from what matters." The words landed heavy between them like stones dropped in still water. Imelda turned away before they could ripple too far, tugging her scarf loose with fingers that fumbled more than they should. "I'll show you the room," Richard said after a moment, voice smoothed back to business. She followed him down a hallway, panelled in warm pine, her boots sinking into rugs thick enough to swallow sound. At the end he opened a door into a space washed in lamplight, a bed draped in a quilt pieced from muted blues and creams, a braided rug softening the floor curtains, stirring faintly at a window rimmed with frost. "There are fresh towels in the chest," he said. "Bathrooms through there." He paused, glancing back. "If you need anything, I won't," she cut in sharper than she meant. Then softer, "Thank you." His gaze held hers a beat too long, green, fractured by something she couldn't name, and then he nodded once and stepped out, pulling the door to with a quiet snick. Imelda stood very still, listening to the hush deepen around her. She moved only when her breath began to fog the glass, peeling away layers stiff with the day's miles. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress cupping her like a question, and let her hands rest on the swell of her belly. The baby shifted under her palms, a slow tidal roll that steadied her heartbeat even as everything else pitched and heaved. Safe, she told herself again, as if repetition could turn hope into truth. But safety, she knew, was never a place. It was a promise that had a way of breaking when the wind changed. Downstairs, Richard stood by the fire, one hand braced on the mantel, the other curved around a glass of amber that caught the flames like trapped sun. He wasn't drinking in months, but tonight the ritual steadied him, the cool press of glass anchoring him in a world that kept tilting. Through the window, the lake sprawled, silent and black, its frozen skin glinting under a bruised moon. Beyond it, the mountains crouched like guards, their jagged shoulders shrouded in mist. A good place to disappear, a terrible place to pretend ghosts couldn't climb. He thought of the message intercepted by a security team, the hospital report weaponised in pixels. He thought of Malik Clark's grin slick as oil, and the promise that always hid behind it every man's past is currency if you know where to spend it. And then he thought of Imelda, her voice raw with confession, her hands splayed over the swell of a child she hadn't named for him, but carried like a compass pointing north. He wondered if she had any idea what it cost him to keep standing still, when every instinct screamed to pull her close and burn the world to cinders for daring to touch her. The fire cracked, a log collapsing in on itself with a sigh. Richard set the glass down and dragged a hand over his jaw, rough with the shadow of a day without end. Behind him the floor creaked. He turned. Imelda stood at the edge of the hearth's glow, wrapped in a sweater soft enough to look borrowed. As he realised the sleeves grazing her knuckles, the hem brushing the curve of her thigh. Her curls spilled loose around her face, catching the firelight in threads of bronze. For a moment neither spoke. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice pitched low as if the walls were listening. Without answering, Richard crossed to the cabinet, pouring water into a cut crystal tumbler. He brought it to her, the brush of his fingers against hers, a spark that threaded straight through his veins. "Thanks." She took a sip, her throat working, and his gaze snagged on the motion before he could tear it away. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "About which part?" Her laugh was brittle. "The blackmail, the fact that my past is being dangled like bait, or the reality that I'm sitting in a stranger's house in the mountains because running feels safer than staying. You think I'm a stranger." His tone wasn't wounded, just curious, like a man mapping the borders of a country he meant to cross. Imelda's gaze lifted to his steady despite the shadows pulled in her eyes. "Aren't you Richard?" Held her stare, something taut pulling between them like a wire. "Maybe," he said finally. "But if I am, tell me why you came." The question hit like a gust through an open door, scattering every fragile thing she'd stacked inside her. Imelda set the glass down the crystal kissing wood with a soft chime and wrapped her arms around herself. "Because—" She stopped, teeth at catching her lower lip, then exhaled a breath that trembled in the firelight. "Because I'm tired of standing in storms I didn't start." Richard's chest tightened a sharp, visceral ache. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough to feel the heat radiating from her, soft and unyielding as gravity. He said, "You won't stand alone here," each word stripped to bone. Something flickered in her eyes, then fear and want braided so tight he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Her hands dropped to her sides, curling into the wool of the sweater, like she needed something solid to hold. And God helped him. He wanted to be that something. He reached up slow, giving her time to turn away. She didn't. His fingers brushed a curl from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear, with a care that felt obscene in a world built on force. Her breath hitched, a slight startled sound seared through him. "Richard," she whispered at his name, fracturing on her tongue. He stilled, every muscle drawn tight as a bowstring. If he kissed her now, there'd be no going back, no lines to redraw, only the free fall. And then the sharp crack of tyres on gravel shattered the hush. Both of them froze. Headlights flared across the window, cutting a blade of white through the dark. Another vehicle was climbing the road, which should have been empty for miles. Richard's hand dropped. In a single motion he crossed to the console by the door, fingers skimming the sleek black of a security monitor. One glance and his mouth hardened to granite. "Stay here," he said, voice clipped, already shrugging into his coat. "Who is it?" Imelda's pulse slammed against her ribs, the taste of copper rising in her throat. His eyes met hers, green shot through with steel. Not someone who comes bearing welcome mats. The fire spat a shower of sparks as the door closed behind him. Imelda stood rooted, her breath loud in the hollow, left by his absence, and felt the first cold fingers of dread curl around her spine. Outside, the wind rose, lifting snow in ghostly swirls. Somewhere beyond the pines an engine growled, low and hungry like a beast circling the edge of light. And in that moment Imelda understood the mountains might hold their secrets, but danger had learnt the roads. The night outside had teeth, Snow hissed across the roof like sand stinging the glass in brittle gusts. Beyond the windows, darkness crouched dense cold and edged with something that didn't belong to nature. Imelda stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, every nerve strung tight, her breath snagging on the sharp hook of silence left in Richard's wake. The fire whispered behind her, a muted crackle that sounded suddenly fragile, as if the flames knew better than to boast. Headlights flared and vanished through the window, slicing the dark with surgical precision before winking out. Whoever was out there had killed the engine. Imelda's pulse stuttered, beating erratically as sleet against the glass. She pressed a hand over her belly, grounding herself in the slow tidal movement beneath her ribs, the baby stubbornly calm, while the world pitched around them. The door opened. She spun, heart jerking up like a startled bird, but it was Richard framed in a gust of wind and white. His coat, flaring hair dusted with snow that melted dark into the wool at his shoulders. His jaw was a blade honed by fury, his eyes shards of green ice. Upstairs, he said, voice low, clipped, dangerous in its quiet. Imelda shook her head, words clawing up her throat. "Tell me what's happening." "They're here," Richard said. 2 men, maybe 3. SUVs parked beyond the tree line. "Malik." Her voice was a whisper, raw at the edges. Richard replied, or someone working his leash, already moving, crossing the room, with that coiled grace she was coming to know too well. He pulled a drawer near the hearth and devised a matte black pistol that caught the firelight like a threat. Imelda's stomach hollowed. "You keep guns here." "I keep contingencies," he said, checking the chamber with a click soft enough to make her shiver. "Go upstairs, Imelda." She didn't move. "And leave you down here to what play hero?" He turned the weapon steady in one hand, his gaze locking on hers. "To make sure you live through tonight." The words struck like a blow, not because they were fierce, but because they were stripped bare of everything but truth. Imelda swallowed hard. "Richard, go," he said, and this time it wasn't a command, it was a plea buried in steel. Something in her relented, though every step toward the staircase felt like betrayal. She gripped the banister, breath soaring in her throat, and climbed one slow dragging tread at a time, until the loft yawned open like a mouth above the fire's flicker. She saw him kill the lights from the landing, plunging the cabin into a darkness veined only by fireglow and the thin silver spill of snowlight through the windows. His silhouette cut clean lines against the hearth, broad-shouldered and unyielding, a man carved from resolve and shadows. Imelda sank to her knees by the railing, hands clutching the wood, and listened to the silence between heartbeats. Outside the night shifted, a crunch of boots on crusted snow, another, closer now, deliberate, like someone savouring the distance closing in. Richard moved without sound, angling toward the window where frost filmed the glass. His breath fogged once in the thin light before he wiped it clear with the back of his hand and peered out. Imelda couldn't see his face, but she felt the air change the way tension slicked through it, like oil when he muttered something sharp under his breath. The first knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a fist, flat and hard against the door, 3 raps that made the beams shudder. Imelda flinched. The baby turned inside her, a slow, patient shift, as if to remind her what was at stake. Richard didn't move. The second knock came louder, punctuated by a voice, low male, and threaded with something that crawled under the skin. "Evening, Harris." Imelda's breath hitched. The name slithered through the dark slick with knowledge. "You've got company," the voice drawled. "Pretty little thing, too. Shame if the wrong people heard she was shackled up in your mountain hideaway." Imelda pressed a fist against her mouth to cage the sound, clawing for release. Below Richard's body stilled a silhouette carved from fury. "You've got 30 seconds to walk away," he said, voice calm as ice over deep water. The man laughed, a sound like gravel ground under boots. "Or what, you'll shoot me. Not your style, Harris. You're a closer, a cleaner. You don't like blood on your own hands." Something in Richard's stance shifted, a subtle tilt that made Imelda's pulse spike. "Try me," he said. A beat of silence followed, thick enough to strangle breath. Then footsteps retreating, crunching over snow. Not far, just enough to regroup. Richard exhaled once, slow, controlled. Then he moved swift and silent, sliding the deadbolt home, checking the sightline to the back door. Imelda gripped the rail harder, her knuckles bloodless, every muscle screaming to move, run and do anything but sit like prey, waiting for the jaws to close. And then the glass shattered. The sound cleaved the night, a crystalline scream, as the side window blew inward under the butt of a rifle. Wind knifed through the breach, flinging snow like shards. Richard dropped rolling behind the arm of the sofa, as splinters sprayed. Down he barked, though she was already flat against the floorboards, her breath tearing in her throat. Two figures poured through the gap, black silhouettes against the storm boots, pounding weapons gleaming dull in the firelight. The first swung toward Richard Muzzle, flashing in a strobe of orange heat. The crack of gunfire split the dark, deafening savage. Imelda clapped her hands over her ears, a scream clawing silent against her teeth as the cabin convulsed with noise and smoke and the hot metallic tang of spent rounds. Richard moved like water fluid, lethal, no motion wasted. He fired once, twice, dropping the first man with a grunt that bled into stillness. The second lunged blade glinting, and for a breath the world narrowed to muscle and steel, to fists slamming into bone, to a groan that rattled the rafters before the intruder crumpled in a heap of blackened blood. Silence fell like ash. Imelda didn't realise she'd been praying until the words died in her throat. She crawled to the edge of the landing, her heart battering her ribs, and saw Richard standing over the wreckage chest, heaving, face-shadowed gun still smoking in his hand. "Are you hurt?" she gasped, her voice shivering loose from shock. His head snapped up. He was at the foot of the stairs in 2 strides, holstering the weapon as he climbed fast, urgent, relentless. Imelda, her name broke like gravel under the wind, rough and raw, as his hands closed around her arms and hauled her upright. His palms burned through the wool, branding heat into bone. "I'm fine," she choked, though the tremor in her knees said otherwise. "The baby." He stilled his grip gently, even as his pulse thundered through his touch. "Is she—" "She's okay," Imelda whispered. Her breath hitched a sob, slicing free before she could cage it. Something in Richard fractured, then not in fury, but in restraint. 1 second there was air between them, the next there was none. His arms locked around her, crushing her to a chest, heaving with the aftershock of violence, his mouth pressed to her hair, in a soundless vow she felt more than heard. "I should never have brought this to your door," he ground out, voice ragged thick with guilt that scraped her raw. "I swore I'd keep you safe. And now God, Imelda, if anything had—" She tipped her face up, cutting him off with the only weapon she had left, the truth shimmering in her eyes. "You did keep me safe." For a breath the world stilled, storm. Blood-broken glass receding until there was only this, the scald of his gaze, the heat of his breath fanning her lips, the shudder that ran through him like a wire pulled too tight. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't polite. It was a collision of fear and fury, of everything unsaid detonating in the dark. His mouth claimed hers with a hunger that scorched his hands, spanning the fragile curve of her waist, as if daring the world to take her from him. Imelda melted and burned all at once, clutching fistfuls of his sweater, drowning in the taste of smoke salt, and something sweeter than sense. The kiss deepened, darkened, until breath was a memory, and time unravelled in molten threads. When he tore back, it was with a sound torn from someplace primal, his forehead pressed to hers, their breaths tangling in a fevered knot. "This doesn't change what's coming," he rasped, every word seared in heat. "But God help me, I'll burn down everything that threatens you. Everything." Imelda cupped his face, her fingers trembling against the roughness of his jaw, and knew without language, without logic, that some tides don't recede. They rise, they claim, they remake the shore in their image. Outside, snow swallowed the night in merciless silence. Inside, the fire guttered low, throwing shadows that curled like secrets across the walls, and engines growled awake, somewhere beyond the reach of lamplight, retreating for now, but not for long, because storms don't break in a single breath. They gather, and this one had only just begun. The fire was dying. Thin tongues of flame licked at charred wood, casting a copper glow that trembled over blood-slick floorboards and shards of shattered glass. The air hung heavy with gunpowder smoke, and something rawer, the scent of fear spliced with want sharp enough to taste. Imelda sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and him. Her hands trembled in their folds, though not from cold. She could still feel the echo of his mouth on hers. A fever burned into memory, into marrow, while her pulse stumbled under the weight of everything that had followed. Across the room, Richard paced the length of the hearth like a caged thing, stripped down to a black T-shirt, clinging damp to his shoulders, his forearms streaked with bruises and someone else's blood. The gun lay disassembled on the coffee table, its pieces gleaming like cruel punctuation between them. No words had bridged the silence since the fight had ended, not when he'd dragged the bodies out into the night with a strength that unsettled her. Not when he'd returned, jaw set hard to bolt the doors and rearm the security system with hands that shook only briefly before closing into fists. And not when he'd knelt in front of her, his eyes burning with questions he didn't ask. Until now. "You should hate me," he said, voice low and rough as though confession scraped his throat raw. Imelda looked up, her breath snagging on the harsh planes of his face, the shadow slashing his cheekbone, the bruise blooming along his jaw. "Why?" He turned eyes, catching the last ember-light green fractured into something savage. "Because I brought this to you. Because I swore no one would touch you. And tonight," his voice broke sharp as shrapnel, "tonight you almost stop," she cut in, fiercer than she felt. "Don't finish that sentence." His chest heaved once, twice, like a man dragged from deep water. Then his hand slammed against the mantelhead, bowing under the weight of words unsaid. Imelda rose, the blanket spilling in a whisper to the floor. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she crossed to him anyway, drawn by something more substantial than sense, more substantial than fear. She laid a hand against his back, the heat of him searing through cotton, and felt the tension shudder under her palm. "Richard," she whispered, and the name felt like an anchor in a storm. "Look at me." He did slowly, as if dragging himself through glass, and God help her, the sight hollowed her out. Not for the fury etched into his face, but for what lived beneath it, guilt sharp enough to bleed grief, lurking like a shadow that refused to move. "You kept me safe," she said. "You kept her safe." Her hand slid down, resting on the curve of her belly, where the baby shifted in some small stubborn gesture of life. "That's all that matters." His eyes fell there on that swell of fragile promise, and something in them had changed when they lifted again. The rage was still there, banked like fire under ash, but another heat smouldered above it, low and relentless. "Repeat it," he rasped. "What?" The words sounded like a prayer muttered through broken teeth, that she's safe. Imelda swallowed, her voice trembling into the hush. "She's safe." The silence that followed was taut enough to snap. Then Richard moved fast but not careless, his hands closing over hers where they rested on her stomach, his grip a brand of heat and vow. His forehead dropped to hers and his breath came ragged, scalding the air between them. "I will end this," he swore, each word dragged from bone. "Malik." The men behind him. "Anyone who thinks they can use you to gut me, I'll burn them to ash before they touch what's mine." The possessive in it should have bristled, should have drawn every wall she had left. Instead, it cracked them wide, flooding her with something she couldn't cage, want braided with a wild, reckless relief. Because for the first time since that night on the highway, she believed him, believed in the brutal certainty behind his promise, the kind that didn't bow to law or mercy. She lifted her face, her lips brushing the scrape of his jaw, and felt his pulse hammer against her mouth. His answering groan was a sound torn from the roots of him, and then his hands were at her hips, pulling her flush against the hard length of him, his mouth crushing hers in a kiss that tasted of smoke and surrender and something perilously close to salvation. The world narrowed to heat and heartbeat, to the drag of his tongue against hers, to the shudder that ripped through him when she fisted her hands in his shirt. The kiss deepened, darkened, until her knees gave and he caught her, always catching her, sweeping her up like weight meant nothing and laying her on the rug before the fire's glow. "Tell me to stop." He ground out against her throat, his breath a brand where it scorched her skin. She didn't, couldn't. Her only answer was a gasp that broke into his mouth when his hand slid down, slow and reverent, over the swell that sheltered everything fragile they hadn't yet said. The storm outside, it howled against the glass, wild and merciless. But inside the cabin, the only sound was breath colliding with breath, the crackle of flames stitching heat through shadow, the low, broken words of a man who had sworn to protect, and now fought the last war he knew how to win against the distance between their bodies. Later, long after the fire sagged into emberlight, after her pulse steadied under the cradle of his arms, Imelda lay tangled in the hush, her cheek pressed to the salt-slick plane of his chest. His heartbeat drummed steady under her ear, but his breath carried the weight of storms not yet spent. "They won't stop," she murmured into the quiet, tasting the truth of it like iron on her tongue. "No," he said, his hand tracing idle circles against her spine. "But neither will I." She lifted her head, studying his face in the low glow, a face cut from will and ruin, shadowed now by something almost like fear. "Then tell me everything," she whispered. "No more half-truths, no more shields. Let me fight with open eyes if I'm already in this war." Richard went still, the muscle in his jaw ticking. For a long brittle beat the only sound was the wind gnawing at the eaves. Then he exhaled a sound like surrender. He said they don't just want money. His voice low, the syllables heavy as stones sinking into dark water. They want control of my name, my companies, my voting rooms most people don't know exist. Malik didn't come alone, Imelda. He came with teeth sharpened by men who play chess with blood. And you, she asked softly, though her heart clawed at her ribs. What game are you playing? He said, the one that ends with them buried, and you untouchable green eyes glinting like shards of stormlight, even if I have to burn every board to ash. The ferocity in it should have chilled her. Instead, it warmed something in her marrow, the knowledge that whatever war he was fighting, he had already chosen his hill, and she was standing on it. She touched his face, then her fingers gentle against the stubble, shadowing his jaw, and saw the steel soften by a fraction. Richard, she whispered, and the name felt like an oath. If we do this and walk into whatever's coming, there's no going back. He said there was never a back, catching her hand and pressing it to his mouth in a kiss that felt like benediction and warning, only through. The words curled through the hush like smoke binding and breaking in the same breath. Imelda closed her eyes, listening to the storm claw at the glass, and knew with bone-deep certainty the tide was coming, and it would not recede until it had remade everything in its wake. Far beyond the cabin, down the serpentine ribbon of Mountain Road, a convoy of black SUVs idled in the hush of pines. In the lead car, a man in a charcoal coat tapped ash into a porcelain dish and smiled a slow reptilian curl that made the night flinch. Tell Harris, he said, his voice a silken blade, that debts don't vanish. They multiply. The driver nodded, eyes blank behind the dashboard's blue glow. The engine hummed alive, a beast stirring in its cage, and the convoy slipped like ink through the snow-laden dark. Back in the cabin, Imelda drifted in the shallow cusp of sleep, her body curved into Richard's, her breath feathering the hollow of his throat. But even as his arms locked around her, as if to weld her to the marrow of his bones, his eyes stayed open, green shards glittering against the ember's sigh, watching the dark beyond the glass. And somewhere in the marrow of that silence a vow took root. If the world wanted war, it would have it, on his terms, on his ground. And God help anyone who touched what he now knew was his. If this moment made your heart race, tell us which line burned into your memory. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share your favourite scene so far, and hit follow so you don't miss the storm still coming, because the next chapter will test everything they've risked and change everything they thought they knew about love.